Chapel Hill.
And I'm Paul Wolff, also from UNC Chapel Hill, with the Carolina Office for Online Learning, soon to be called the Digital and Lifelong Learning. And today we're going to be talking to you a little bit. It's a little bit of a reflection activity, but we're going to be talking about everything we've been going through over the past few months, both from the perspective of, last fall before all this even happened and looking forward to this particular conference in New York, all the way to our specific timeline that took place as we engaged with this crisis and remote instruction. And then we're gonna do a little bit of reflection where we look through the quality standards and which ones really stood out to us as we were engaging with this. And so we'll talk through that and the standards that kind of bubbled to the top and became most salient and important during this crisis. And we'd love to hear from you all at that point as well about your experiences. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Gigi to kick it off.
All right, so in this session, we'd like you to leave with a little bit of discussion points on how universities have tried to balance quality with the demands of emergency remote instruction, and to reflect on how the current situation might have shifted or shed some different light on the elements in the QM rubric, and maybe think about some takeaways from the present moment that would benefit distance education in your setting. So to kind of kick it off, I just want to kind of go back to this picture, this old line from the original QM call for participation in the conference. And it started off, get the inspiration you need at the 2020 East Regional Conference in New York City. And I was thinking about this because places do have such an impact on us, and being around people, being energized, leaving kind of the everyday lives and going somewhere else. And this is something that critics of online learning often point to, saying somehow, oh, I need that physical contact and that place contact. So I think a lot of us are in the position of often citing evidence and reasons why there's value in distance education and digital learning. But at the same time, we've all experienced this shift recently. And at a certain point, we recognize that this was the line that we are now moving online. And so while that shift is kind of fresh and we're all grappling, we're sort of all in the same position. Paul and I were just thinking about how we wanted to take this opportunity to reflect with this group and think about, what does it take to build a learning environment that is strong and connected? What are we seeing? What this is bringing out of people? And so with that in mind, we just thought we'd kind of walk through the last 2 months. And please feel free to join the conversation by adding anything that you want in the chat. We had sort of imagined this as a little bit of like a fireside chat moment at the end of the conference. Just we have a lot of curiosity about whether some of our experiences are aligned with things that you've all been thinking about and wondering about. But so starting it off, for context, our university doesn't have like a broad range of online offerings. We do have some established master's programs, but we're in a pretty ad hoc stage of QM implementation. So for us, it was a massive transition. There was no infrastructure in our university for the kind of wholesale shift to online. And so the first thing that really struck us was this keen awareness of collaboration. All the people in different roles you have. This image, just you have sort of the experts inside and people monitoring, and then the astronauts that are just like out in space and feeling very at risk and very vulnerable. So this balance of fear and expertise and communication kind of settled into this keep teaching movement and moment, really. And I'm sure you all participated in developing resources and sharing resources on the Google Doc that came up. It was so fast how people started really trying to mobilize and support each other. And the first theme that seemed to really come to the surface was this idea of continuity, continuity as opposed to quality. We want it to be as good as we can, but really we just want things to keep going. So these were looking over all of the Keep Teaching sites. There was intentional differentiation between online learning and design and instructional continuity, class continuity, academic continuity. But alongside that, we noticed a really strong theme of connection and communication and compassion. It was just very striking how much people emphasized empathy, flexibility, and understanding, and really trying to make the learners and the instructors real. What are they dealing with in their homes? What are their family situations like? Maybe they're going to get sick in the next few months. This push to really visualize the learner as a real being who is experiencing all the contingencies of life. That's something I think we all try to do, but I certainly think that it takes a little bit of a back seat to just getting things going. But it was really powerful in our setting to see so many people trying to articulate and grapple with this reality that there are these real people in this circumstance, in ways that I think started to become policies, to become kind of recommended best practices. And it was very interesting to see how different organizations and learning experts tried to articulate this and tried to figure out, how do we implement this? So in some places they settled on more change. Let's move everything asynchronous. Let's make things as flexible and easy as they can be. And in other places, like we see in the Academy of Art, in the Green Box, they wanted to minimize those changes to create consistency and some kind of predictability for students. Many of the Keep Teaching sites, the first thing they say are, is communicate, communicate, communicate. This is, calm your students' fears, let them know you're committed to their success, share how you intend to support them. So there were different messages that were crafted around all of these initiatives. And we were really curious to know what your university stressed. If there was a focus on, at Gallaudet, you could see they, sorry about that, we're really trying to say, these are difficult times, but we're not going to let our standards down. I know in our university, I think there was an effort to say, just connect, connect with your students, try to, check in with them. And if you do have to shift some things or accept something that's messy, that's okay. And I think that people have to deal with those things in different ways. And we were very curious to know kind of what you all had been experiencing. So Paul's going to walk through kind of more specifically the strategies that we use to contain these sort of this process.
Yeah, thank you, Gigi. And I will make this quick. We definitely don't need to belabor every single step that took place during all of this. But I'll walk you through, since I was there kind of at the beginning as we started to strategize, all the way up to next week, which is when we're kicking off a couple of new initiatives. And we'll just look at how we approached it. It may be similar to some of your universities, it may be different. So we can go ahead and jump into that. So to start off with, we were monitoring in early to mid-February what was going on in Italy and South Korea and just globally, and seeing how they were reacting. And in often cases, they were shutting down universities and moving to remote instruction. So with that as a possible outcome, we started to prepare, and we had this task force that got put together. And so as we moved into March, that task force started to meet more frequently as we started to plan and ideate what we were gonna do at our university. And I just want to echo what Gigi said earlier about that collaborative effort across the country. There were just so many professional organizations sharing resources from different universities taking leadership in saying, hey, this is how we're handling it. And certainly as we developed our own Keep Teaching site, that was modeled after other universities' Keep Teaching sites that we reached out to and got permission to use, say, a general structure or the URL even of Keep Teaching, which became, whoever coined that at whatever university, that certainly has become kind of the model at so many, with Keep Teaching, Keep Learning, and sometimes Keep Working as well. But we started out with just 4 sections, and that would eventually grow to have many more sections and services that we were offering. As we moved into mid-March, we were continuing to have those daily check-ins, but we were also starting to strategize about new service offerings that we could be that we could be offering faculty. And just so you know, at this point, we had not decided to go remote. We were still anticipating that. But we had a pretty good sense that that was probably the direction things would go, because we were, at this point, you're starting to see other major universities, certainly in Seattle, in New York, some of the Ivies had started to make the call. We were in the middle of spring break at this point. And so we started building out some training materials. We started building out an ID consultation service that would allow professors to fill out a form about what they're struggling with, and they would get a one-on-one consultation with an instructional designer. So we had to build that service out. It didn't exist. None of this existed, right? So then the real important date came, and that was March 11th. And so on March 11th, our chancellor announced officially that we were going to extend spring break a full week so that we could take the time to, as much as possible, prepare for remote instruction, to give our faculty that extra week. And so while we at that point didn't know it, eventually we would make the decision that students would not be returning to campus. And so that next day, starting on March 12th, we started offering training. So first thing the next morning on March 12th, we offered 6 trainings, and then another 6 on that Friday. And then we recorded those sessions, put them up on the Keep Teaching site. That weekend, a group of us worked really hard to build out that consultation service. And over the course of the next few days, we would go on to train 40 different volunteers from around campus to be ID consultants. Some of them were faculty, some were instructional designers at our disparate units around campus. We're kind of a siloed university. And we offered both one-on-one consultations and departmental consultations. And then as we went into the latter half of March, we created a forum on the Keep Teaching site where people could ask questions asynchronously. We started to have these learning community chats, which were a little bit more informal, where instructors could come sit down with some experts and some faculty who had taught online before. And they were centered around specific topics where instructors may be struggling, like, for example, remote assessment, right? And so we would offer some of those community chats and just have an informal discussion. And then as we moved into April, what we have started to do is, the announcement was made about summer. We're going to be remote as well at that time. So we started to replicate all of this again. So we started offering new training sessions for summer, and specifically targeting summer and that shortened time frame, but also the idea that you're launching remotely as opposed to spring, where you did half your course face-to-face and had to make this awkward transition. So we're trying to move the needle a little bit and improve what we're offering in summer. We're also doing that for our non-academic units like orientation and some other programs that would have been residential, where we're offering these same services, showing them how to use Zoom and some strategies they could use with our LMS to still offer their programs. And then as we move into next week, we actually are starting to train a group of teaching assistants. This says 35, but it ended up being 38 actually, teaching assistants who were hired. And they specifically were hired to help build out in our LMS, which is Sakai, and to help an instructor use Zoom and some of the technological components. And they'll be paired with an instructional designer on our team who will mentor them through that process. So they'll have an ID mentor giving them best practices and offering guidance. They'll have a TA who then helps them build the site. And the hope is that what we offer in the summer is a step better than what we offered in the spring. And then we are also at the same time creating a course that instructors can go through to get best practices online in terms of course design and in terms of in terms of online teaching, with that being kind of an opening salvo for them into really thinking intentionally about designing their course and teaching online. And then we're looking at APPQMR as being a second tier for those that end up enjoying it or want to learn more or want to improve their course even more. And we'll probably add in some other components there, but we're already looking to fall is the short of that. So that's generally where things are. I will say that the first month and a half that I just talked about was a response to an emergency. Quality was not really a priority. It was a much lower consideration than so many other things, many of which Gigi's alluded to. when it comes to compassion and thinking about where everybody is and the struggle of what everyone's going through. And it was very intentionally framed as remote teaching and remote learning as opposed to online. And we all know that that is a very different thing. And then that early April, as we started looking at summer and trying to move the needle a little bit, we were looking at something kind of in between those two, right? So early April, we're making some quality improvements. Those are being introduced, but we're not, that's looking ahead to summer. We're not really implementing those in the spring because we just didn't have the time. And as we look forward to the rest of the summer, that's where we're starting to actually incorporate QM and some online instructor training with the hope that by the time we get to fall, we are getting closer to what we would consider, something that is a QM approved type course. Although we know that in all likelihood, that's only going to be for a subset of our courses because not everybody can be trained. Not everybody is going to want to get trained. It's very much a cultural issue at our institution.
So at this point, we sort of wanted to shift and make the conversation a little bit more general. And I would invite you to participate in a poll on Poll Everywhere. I can write not that it's a live link, but in moving courses online due to COVID-19, which QM general standards have been viewed as most critical at your learning organization? And the goal of asking this question, or our interest in it, was just to kind of get a sense of where you focused your biggest energy. It sounds like when Brian was talking about maybe assessment, like making sure there's sort of training in order to finish that final assessment, or I don't know if that would be your answer, Brian, but just where has the energy been most closely concentrated? And we are just interested in maybe getting a sense of how different organizations or different teams have been approaching this, or even how you have felt that your energies are being spent. Just let it run for a minute or two, well, second or two. Let's see if this works. Okay, is everyone seeing the responses or the? Great, so that's really interesting. Learner activities and learner interactions scores big. I'd love to know if there's, if anyone wants to throw anything in the chat about, what they're thinking about in that area. Wish we could unmute you. Assessment, accessibility, yeah.
It is very interesting. I think that, and this was our experience as well, as you'll see, that the learning objectives and competencies was not at the forefront, although as you'll see, we certainly had a slightly different experience with the things that bubbled to the top for us and were most important.
Yeah, and Rita makes a good point that interaction, of course, there's a translation going on, and so there was a lot of interest in that area for sure. So we thought we'd just sort of walk through and maybe dig in a little bit deeper to see. Now these highlighted areas are the specific review standards that we felt kind of just ended up being kind of implemented. People paid a lot of attention to them, and some of the things that seemed to kind of recede a little bit. And I'd be curious if you see one on our list that's not highlighted, or that was something really different in your thinking about these kind of minimum standards, the continuity standards might be interesting. Please feel free to put that out there as well. Yeah. Right. So they were discussed, the objectives were discussed, but maybe there wasn't like a sense of critical assessment or alignment going on. I was going to make a pun about like essential standards because of essential workers, but it just seemed like it might give the wrong message. So yeah, so this general standard one, I think, fared pretty well. Most of the 3-point and the essential review standards did turn out, to be very important in the setting, as you could imagine, just giving signposts to learners, over communicating clarity. Yeah, this is something that I think especially 1 through 3 of the general standard 1 were very important. People were very keenly aware of that on an intuitive level. The way that they aren't actually when they're designing their courses in normal circumstances, it seemed like people really understood the importance of making everything explicit.
Yeah, I would say that we certainly emphasized it in all our trainings, the need to over communicate even, but certainly to let learners know and connect them. But I was interested by the fact that as things progressed, looking back at what we did, 1.4 and 1.5 actually became more important as things went on, and we realized later that those were things we should have been emphasizing in our trainings that maybe were an oversight initially. Certainly, as institutional policies changed around this, and then a lot of policies did, especially around grading and new grade entry codes and things like that, and then certainly around minimum technology requirements, because we started to really need to push the idea that our students are in different situations and they may or may not be able to abide by what you were considering to be a minimal technology requirement that they didn't actually sign up for when when they signed up for this course, because it was in a different setting.
So for general standard 2 and 3, as we've kind of alluded to, those deeper structures of the course are much more complicated to pivot. Also, there's a lot of courses that no one's really seen. When I think that's something that comes up in the APPQMR training. This might be the one chance that this course has to be viewed by somebody else. A lot of courses that have been taught for years, nobody really sees them except the student and the instructor. So but these, of course, but we didn't have the bandwidth or the scope to really deal with them. Although the question of assessment that's already come up was a focus. Paul, did you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so that one is one that at the beginning, when we were really first preparing our instructors in that, extra week of spring break, assessment, and especially thinking about final exams, was something we just kind of tabled. We didn't have a good solution for it, so we let them know, we'll get you an answer, but we're not there yet. And as things progressed, and we started to really see student situations and some faculty situations where they might have limited broadband or any other competing priority right now in a crisis, we realized that we couldn't offer, and it would create equity issues, we felt. And I was actually pretty proud of our university for taking that stance, but it would create equity issues to use tools like browser lockdowns and proctored assessments. And so we made a conscious decision to move to alternate forms of assessment where students could perhaps demonstrate that they had learned what they needed to in the course through a portfolio or a presentation or something of that nature. And then the other thing that changed is that in many cases, they had to shift, instructors, what they had originally put in their syllabus as the grading policy and what would be graded and how things would be weighted. And it was really important for us to not overly weight the beginning of the semester, which was taught under quote unquote normal conditions, because some students may have struggled at the beginning of your course, and now you're kind of putting them at a disadvantage as we move into the second half of the course, where they may have started to grasp materials and do better. So there were a lot of nuanced considerations there that I don't think we anticipated at the beginning, but that developed over time. And certainly I would say the last couple of weeks of our work has really focused, because today's LDOC for us, so starting Monday will be final exams. The last couple of weeks has really focused through our consultations and our trainings on that assessment, and how can you take this course and present your final exam in a way that isn't being proctored, but then at the same time minimizes the risk of cheating in this environment.
So looking to General Standard 4, 5, and 6, I think we've talked a little bit about how the interaction was a concern, and I think it remains a concern for a lot of faculty in a very large way, in sort of a comprehensive way. It's not just about the individual learning activities, but how to create that relationship. Like, how am I possibly going to be the kind of teacher that I want to be? And that's just not something that typically the instructors that I've worked with in the past have talked very much about. Most of them are already, whether or not they have a lot of experience with online learning, they're familiar with the format, but that having to experience this dramatic shift, I think, opened up in some ways opportunities for people to think about how they could do it really, really well, the way that they would want to in the best possible circumstances. That being said, developing new activities, nobody really had time for that, but there were a lot of discussions about those kinds of questions. Of course, instructional materials, the need for digital materials or clay or biology labs and things like that. I'm sure those were also an issue. And then, of course, just the technology, the fact that that people needed basic training in a lot of the tools that they were going to be using.
Yeah, and I was so proud of some of our instructors for the creative ways they approached learning activities and learner interaction. There were so many great stories of, you know, an instructor that teaches costume design going around and delivering outside of student apartments the dummies that you use to, you know, make a costume on. I don't remember what those are called, but you know, that, and then we had instructors that took the crisis and made it part of their curriculum now. So, you know, an instructor that was doing something on podcasts and teaching students to create a podcast, and eventually that was like the final project. It involved interviewing people around campus in many cases. So that kind of fell out. And instead she gave them the opportunity to instead do a podcast on all of this and what they're experiencing and what they're seeing. And so it was just so cool to see the creative approaches so many of them came up with through our consultations. And I will just speak to the course technology piece a bit, because that was a huge component of this, but it was more instead of promoting learner engagement and active learning, a lot of it was more focused on just making sure instructors and students were trained in how to use the technology. And we really pushed a couple of technological solutions that would solve the problem for a lot of courses. So that was our strategy: is let's knock out as many as we can with the solution of use the LMS tools and use Zoom. And then for those that need something else, we'll pick those off one at a time. But technology training became a huge component of this whole process. I will also say that as we've been doing the training for summer school, I've been very excited to see that many of our instructors are asking questions about, okay, so we've got the basics from spring, but as we move into summer, what recommendations do you have around active learning and engagement and motivation? And so they are trying now to make it better than what they just experienced. And they recognize, I think, in many cases, that what they just did is not taking advantage fully the various tools and functionality that an online course can provide, which really can be such a positive experience for so many students. So they've struggled through it, and now they want to make it better.
We put this sort of big arrow from learner support because in sort of reviewing the standards and thinking about what really rose to the surface, we were realizing that learner support just became the full project. Everybody was a part of learner support because there's just too much need to go along. So there was a Keep Learning website, there were collaborations between the student affairs and our team, and pulling together a lot of recommendations from a lot of different areas of expertise. And so in a way, the support piece wasn't broken down into sort of very individual components, but a scan over the entire kind of landscape of online learning and the position of the learner in a way that I think was really interesting, and that gives us some kind of ideas for the future and how we might want to emphasize that more. And then, of course, accessibility. We have a fabulous group of 3 people in our university. They're brand new. They've been there like 4 or 5 months, and they were present in all of the trainings, I think, just making sure that questions could be answered about alt text and some of the fundamental parts of accessibility. We were just very lucky to have them there.
Yeah, and they offered up their own consultation service as well, just centered on accessibility, if that's what your question was about. One thing I will say, the Keep Learning site got developed a little bit later than the Keep Teaching. One of the things that's been really great is they put out a survey just to kind of get the pulse of students and to find out what they're concerned about, where their struggles are. And we had over 10,000 responses to that with, a population of students that's around 30,000. So that was really great that a third of our student population responded to that survey. And I'm on the committee that looks at it from the remote learning standpoint. And just there we had 1,600 of those 10,000 indicated in some way, shape, or form that they had concerns around remote learning or were struggling with remote learning. And we've been going through those survey responses. We set up an email account that students can email directly about anything they're having an issue with, and it gets triaged to the appropriate group. So just a lot of really intentional and compassionate thinking about where our students are and how we can best support them in this time of crisis. We've had so many positive responses from our students about how supported they feel in many cases. And those that aren't feeling supported, we want to know that too, so that we can find out what's missing. It's been just really great to see.
So we have another survey for you, and this is sort of looking ahead to the summer and potentially this fall. As you're thinking about whatever role you have, whether it's in your own course or if you work with faculty, whatever your involvement is, if you could pick 2 of the general standards or 2 areas of the course to really focus on and really improve, or just make more robust, where would you put your energy or hope to see the most effort being placed? And this is that same. So it looks like a fair number of people want to kind of, let's look at alignment. Let's look to see if the course is kind of internally coherent and maybe go back to some of that core thinking. And I'm curious, does anyone want to sort of add any detail to what they chose, or kind of maybe a pet peeve of what's happening right now, or something that they would like to, any particular specific review standard, or something they feel like could use some effort? Or you could remain discreet.
Yeah. Rita, that was my experience as well with many of the courses that I worked with. And certainly as I'm looking ahead to summer and fall, course alignment, course mapping, getting those learning objectives fleshed out is going to be a focus for us as well.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, with Paul's kind of scaled return to quality standards, it's almost like the timeline determines a lot of it, because how much can we implement in 2 weeks for this
Right.
one summer session, or in 3 weeks. So right, catching it right at the beginning is going to be part of our planning process.
Yeah, and Lisa's point that it needs to not be about the technology, and technology is a tool that can support, but it shouldn't be the driving factor.
Yeah. It was interesting. I did a sort of review of the Keep Teaching sites, and I think there was such a need just to know the basic instructions. How do I do this? That some of them really are all about the technology and how you set up your site and what do you do to start a Zoom meeting. And it you definitely feel the urgency and the importance of that, but also there were a lot of schools that tried to blend that with just try to use this to communicate, and it might not work, and that's going to be okay, and to be reassuring about that. And I think that that's true with our regular courses too, that it's the connection that you want to do. Yeah.
It's funny.
Sorry, Albert, I interrupted you. Okay, so where will you go next? What will you do from here? Is there anything that you think, yeah, right. And I think, Rachel, I appreciate that comment so much, because that attention to where students actually are instead of kind of our standards and our expectations has been, I think, a really important part for a lot of us working here I notice that we have a mandate to reach out to students and ask them how they're doing, because in this particular unusual circumstance, we're aware, or more aware, probably not as aware as we should be, that people are always in crisis. It's not just COVID-19. That can always be happening to any of our students. And I think some of the ways that we've emphasized compassion, flexibility, giving people the benefit of the doubt is something that we need to be bringing into the culture of our own quality standards, and seeing those as really important to convey in the course structure, and in our assumptions about how students will interact with courses. So that's something that I know we are thinking a lot about and trying to really capture from this moment. So yeah, is there any other thoughts in the group, or
One little anecdote I'll share is, on that Keep Learning survey I was talking about, and the email address we created, a student had reached out to us about the fact that she was having a lot of trouble with broadband issues and she couldn't access the online textbook resources. And one of my colleagues who was on that committee with me realized it was her course. And the student had not reached out to her as the instructor, which I think speaks to the fact that often our students, especially our undergrads, feel very intimidated about reaching out to faculty. She ended up mailing the student a copy of the textbook. I mean, she's probably one of the most open and helpful instructors and willing to work with her students. But it just, it was very eye-opening that student reached out to us through a centralized channel about a problem rather than reaching directly out to the instructor. I will say that it's been really encouraging to see. I think times of crisis like this often bring out the best in people. And so many people have been considerate and compassionate and kind with their students. And I do hope that this moves the needle a little bit for some of them, as Gigi was just saying, that they'll think about this after we do get through all of this, that they'll continue to think about their students and their situations in a way that, right now they're also living it, but later, hopefully this will help them to think about their students and empathize with their situations.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's any other questions. Maybe I'll, thanks, Cecilia. I stopped sharing.
Yeah, we definitely wanted to leave a little time at the end in case anyone had had questions or things that they wanted to talk about as it relates to this or reflect on. Certainly a reflective presentation and exercise we were hoping.
One example that I really liked, Paul, that you mentioned was the decision to let students drop courses up until the last day. I thought that was an interesting thought experiment to think, why is that such a big deal? I mean, it's an interesting, thing to think about, some of the different ways people are thinking, and then think about what's the reason behind them to begin with. So thank you.
Yeah, as we're changing a lot of our policies, the different grades that they're able to take, certainly the pass fail that just got mentioned in the chat, and then the ability to drop up until the last day of class, the ability to take sort of what we're calling a CV, which stands for coronavirus, but it gets flagged that way, and you can take an incomplete until you're at a point where you do have reliable internet, or you can come back to campus if you really, really are having a hard time completing your course. So many things are happening that we're seeing trending out there, and universities are communicating with each other. So I think it will be interesting, when this is over, to look back at some of those policies and say, why are we doing that way? Is it just that we've always done it? And is it disadvantaging some of our students?
Well, I would hope, if other people have thoughts on this in the future, to hear about them in some way. I think it's an opportunity for us all to just look at things in a new way, and kind of just keep thinking about who are our learners and what position that we're all in. So yeah, let us know if you're working on something, or if you have initiatives at your school that you feel like sharing, just to support that. Yeah, some of these comments they're great.
Yeah, the most recent one, that this COVID incident is going to change so much. I mean, I think certainly, as you noted in the chat about from Sandra about students teaching and learning, but so much of our society is probably going to change. I'm seeing other fields where, because they've moved to online meetings and telemedicine and things, they're going to do that going forward. And they've already made that call, or working from home. Just so many things I think are going to be looked at in a different way, but definitely our field, when it comes to online learning and online teaching, we have the opportunity to really make that a staple at universities where maybe it wasn't before.
Yeah, Marcy, I just want to appreciate that point. The way students became the priority was extraordinary. Yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing too. And I'm just really appreciating the chance to hear that you've been noticing that, and that's happening, I'm sure, all over.
Well, certainly we are all in this together. And I know all of you at your various institutions have probably been working crazy hours, and doing some pretty heroic work. So kudos to everyone for everything you've been doing at your institutions. I know that the students and the faculty appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming to be with us.
And Gigi and Paul, I want to thank both of you for presenting today. I know you were planning, when you put this together, probably to do it face to face, but COVID has changed that, and so you had to do it in another modality. And thank you very much. I am posting the links in the chat to the surveys, and then the next session will be the town hall.
Great.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and thanks everybody for